Okay, so I did my project on intelligent testing in Ellis Island. So kind of leading up to this movement was the rise of eugenics, and eugenicists were concerning themselves with how hereditary played a role into our behaviors, and they wanted to look at how we could resolve mental and neurological issues that were caused by the hereditary issues. And one of those were feeble-mindedness, and they thought it was caused by a genetic mental disorder. And Henry Goddard was a popular eugenicist who was looking into feeble-mindedness in children, and his famous study was the Kallikak family study, and it supported that there was a hereditary link between intelligence and genetics. So he used the Binet-Simon intelligence scale and translated it from French to English, and used it for his intelligent testing, and he presented it to the American Breeders Association, who were concerned with eugenics at the time, and his findings again supported the idea that feeble-mindedness is hereditary. So this was basically a huge win for the genetics movement, for the eugenics movement. So the start of the testing, they wanted to find ways that they could improve the United States people. One way they did that was from preventing people from reproducing, and another way was from preventing people from entering the United States who they found were feeble-minded. So Henry Goddard teamed up with the United States Public Health Services, and they wanted to help control who came into the United States. So they used the Binet IQ test to administer it to immigrants upon their arrival into Ellis Island. So at the beginning of the testing, he found that 83% of Jews, 80% of Hungarians, 79% of Italians, and 80% of Russians were considered to be feeble-minded, or in some severe cases, morons. The other terms were imbecile and idiot, and this is how he categorized IQ and his different kinds of classification. So these numbers supported the need for further testing in Ellis Island. So the U.S. Public Health Services used intelligent tests to determine who was feeble-minded and would be sent back home. They argued that the testing was necessary to uphold the integrity of the country. They thought that those who were feeble-minded would produce children whose genetic makeup would be the same. They argued that they would end up in poverty or institutions like prisons or asylums. They believed these people were criminals and addicts. So moving in to Ellis Island, those in first and second class got to skip ahead and just go straight into the United States, while other immigrants really endured a hard journey overseas with poor living conditions, already under a great deal of psychological stress. They entered the Great Hall, and basically this is where they would get their fate decided for them. So the first thing they had to do was pass a series of physical exams. So this would be looking if they had any visible illnesses, disease, or any defects on the body. And then they had their mental tests, which were short versions of tests because they only had so much time with each person. And then they were asked questions. So they're asked if they had any radical views, if they had any assets and money, and then personal information, background questions, so where are you coming from, where are you going, and then other questions. So some of the questions they asked are like, what is your occupation? Are you able to read and write? What country are you from? What is your race? And what is your last permanent place of residence? So those who needed more testing were sent to a separate line, and this might mean like you failed a test, you didn't answer a question correctly, and they wanted to look at you further. Ellis Island was nicknamed the Island of Tears because of all of the people that it sent away. In 1914, the records show that almost 1,000 immigrants were sent back home. So later they recognized that the Binet-Simon test wasn't a good measurement because the immigrants didn't know English and American culture, so it was culturally unfair for them. So they kind of moved away from that, and then they moved to the Knox Cube test, the Form Board test, and the Feature Profile test. 2 of the 3 tests were made by Howard Knox, and I'll talk about them, but they were more culturally fair. They didn't have anything to do with language or culture, so it was really fair for the immigrants who were taking the tests. So the Knox cube test were 4 cubes that were tapped in an order and they needed to be replicated. So the picture kind of shows you the different cubes here on the bottom and then how they were tapped and then they needed to be replicated in that similar sequence. And then the feature profile test, they were given the different pieces of wooden blocks and then told that this is a head, put this together as quickly as you can, and then they were timed. And then the form board test, they had all of the different cutout shapes and they had to put them in the right cutouts. These tests worked on working memory, sequences, processing speed, and perceptual reasoning, which are still things that we look at in intelligent tests today. So like I was saying, these are more culturally fair for the people that were taking them. And then changes to the field. Americans were no longer supporting the eugenics movement during World War II. Hitler credited the United States plan to improve the master race in American societies, and we basically looked in the mirror and realized that what we were doing was similar to that of what was happening overseas in Europe, and we realized that it was really bad and that we shouldn't probably be doing that anymore. And then stereotypes around immigration. During this huge wave of immigration, they took really bottom-end barrel jobs with poor pay. They weren't always treated with kindness and respect, and they often thought that immigrants were less intelligent, and you can make that argument that those same stereotypes are still around today. And then improvement to intelligent testing. Tests are now culturally fair, and they should hold little to no cultural bias, depending on the test. And then increased validity. So the tests and the results are correlated. It's actually measuring IQ. And then reliability. The results are consistent across the board. And then the tests are now standardized for all, including those with intellectual disabilities. These are my references. Any questions? Yes.
In one of your first slides, you showed particular ethnicities, Jewish, Hungarian, Italian, and one more that I can't remember.
Russians.
What's that?
Russians.
Russians, thank you. Why only those ethnicities?
I think because those were the ones that were coming across, and it was probably the big categories of people that they saw coming through.
So if somebody wasn't those ethnicities, they might have still been tested, but they just wasn't maybe large numbers, so you don't have the numbers.
They also could have been, I'm not sure, but I'm assuming they might have been clustered.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the form board thing that they use for testing, was that like the first instance of form boards being used? Because now they're used for like children, right? Like puzzles?
I'm not sure. That one was the one that wasn't made by Howard Knox, so you could assume that it was previously made.
You said that they turned 1,000 people away one year. How many people were trying, came through, or the percentage-wise of what they turned away?
Well, I read that over the span that Ellis Island was open, they had 12 million people come through. But during this time, it said that they had increased deportation rates from 400%.
Did the use of the culturally fair tests change the rates of deportation?
I would assume. I'm not sure, but I would assume so because they're more culturally fair.